In 25 years, when someone asks what life was like during the COVID lockdowns, how will you respond? Story 1: COVID sparked something in me, and I've been on fire ever since. I started mowing lawns out of the trunk of my 03 Accord, then taught myself how to climb and remove trees properly. Now I've got a big truck, a trailer, and a ton of equipment. Before all this, I was an alcoholic server bartender, super depressed. Now, 2 of my teenage kids live with me, and I'm in the best shape of my life. Story 2. Girlfriend of a couple of years moved in with me a few months prior to lockdown, and the ensuing months, years of being around her all the time made us realize that we were pretty much made for each other. Now married with twins on the way. Rest of lockdown was, though. Story 3. I was a so-called essential worker here, meaning I worked at Home Depot, and every rich motherer in 100 miles came in giggling about how they're so excited to be doing home renovations with all the free time they have right now. And oh, we know we're not supposed to go out, but we're just so bored at home. Meanwhile, my workload went up tenfold overnight. I went home every day sore and exhausted while corporate refused to hire more employees. I didn't recover from the burnout for a few years. It was awful. Story 4. It certainly made me well aware of my privilege. Some people were going through absolute hell, but we were relatively unscathed, bar the bizarre chaos unfolding. No planes in the sky, no cars on the road. Some moments were very peaceful. People forgot how to drive. Taking an allowed trip to the shop, I noticed people stopped giving a about how well they were driving. 1 hour outside exercise a day, the rule of 6, continually changing rules, banging pots and pans, an utterly inept and corrupt government. It's strange to see social distance markers in stores and public spaces now, faded and forgotten about. Story 5. I'll probably say it felt like living in a weird time loop. Every day was the same, but also somehow completely different. It was a mix of baking bread, Zoom calls, and trying to stay sane, while the world felt like it was falling apart. Definitely a time nobody will forget. Story 6. I worked in retail, biggest supermarket in the region. First, people were cautious and friendly. 2 weeks and shelves were empty and people were pissed. Every other started discussing the rules and COVID as a whole. We even had fights happen regularly, mostly because of deniers getting into other people's business. That pissy behavior lasted till today. COVID killed a lot of people, but it also killed a lot of decency in the people. Story 7. A test run of how badly this country would handle a severe crisis. We know that the people will turn on themselves. We know there will be hoarding, and we know that science and reason will be enemies. Could have been a time of unification and strength. Instead, it was the opposite. And frankly, we're lucky it was mostly inconvenient to most Americans. Story 8. Weird and eye-opening. I saw on large scale just how full of everyone is. And that's across the board, not supporting any side of any issue. I had some strange realization that the only reason I watched professional sports was because I always watch professional sports. Once COVID happened and the leagues halted, I realized I didn't really need to watch millionaires playing children's games. I got outdoors and came to an understanding that media, for the most part, is just a cycle of outrage and fear in order to keep people hooked for consumption purposes. Thanks, but I'll be fishing as the world burns, and what common household item in my cabinet might kill me. Story 9. That's when it was clear that as a nation we were very dysfunctional. I remember going into a grocery store wearing a mask. A man muttered sheep when he saw me. I responded, "Oh, this?" as I pointed to my mask. "This isn't for COVID. I have the flu and don't want to give it to anyone." He sincerely thanked me for my consideration. Story 10. Lonely. I'd started a new school the day of the lockdown. I had to leave early from that day, even because I had appendicitis. It was surreal. All the doctors and nurses were wearing trash bags, and the guys in the ambulance were wearing actual gas masks, we asked. Everyone was freaked out. Story 11, nurse here. I have COVID the beginning of that March, just before it became a labeled pandemic. My symptoms weren't lying what people were told, so I wasn't sure at first. My skin physically hurt to the touch. Severe nausea, achy body, and headaches. With that said, after 2 weeks of recovery, I worked back to work at our COVID quarantine unit. At that time, I was the only one to have gotten it. Got paid nice in the quarantine unit too, peaceful as well. We had about 20 beds, our own entrance exit. Only admissions I received were confirmed COVID patients, and for better or worse, most were pretty chill with it. I sadly saw many die, tried to save many as well. Seen people decline within an hour super fast. Pulse ox gradually going down. Was crazy. Quite a few survived too. Some needed O2 for months, yes art after. Some fully recovered. Nice bonuses of hundreds of dollars. No other bull interruptions from management staff. I was on my own island with my lone CNA. We had a little isolated break room as well. I'd pick up shifts, bonus for COVID, bonus for picking up, and relieve my buddy for 12 hours. He'd come back and relieve me. Did this for months. I don't think I've ever had such a lucrative time working. So while others had to close down and quarantine, isolate, lack in-person interaction, I still went out and worked. So my perspective on COVID seems to be much different than most. My wife's a teacher, and our kids were young, elementary and middle school. They have very different perspectives than I. Story 12. Our government shoved 1 million normals into an active volcano while scrambling to send blank checks to wealthy individuals who already could have retired at any given moment, under the knowingly insincere guise of helping small businesses who got shafted. All pocketed for personal use, all blindly forgiven by both the previous and current administrations. And if when those wealthy folks got COVID, it was code red, and we gave them real health care, experimental, etc., to keep them alive. Oh, and tons of people pretended, and still pretend, that we were under China-style lockdowns because Applebee's switched to pickup only for like 2 weeks. El Mao, one of the most unserious and faith-losing periods that I've experienced living in the U.S. for 30-plus years. Story 13. It was realizing that 50% of people are amazingly gullible and ready to ruin actual freedom in the name of safety and virtue signaling. Old people and fat people will always be susceptible to diseases, and trying to close people's businesses and ruin their lives over it was the biggest government overreach in the history of America. I'm sorry if you lost someone to COVID, but you should blame Fauci and the Wuhan lab for it. Story 14. We had a relatively free society here in Sweden. Face masks were never a requirement, only a recommendation. Basically, all restaurants and shops were open, but there were requirements for social distancing, a non-problem for a Swede. What was sad was that basically all concerts, theater performances, and major social activities were on hold indefinitely during it. There was a time when I thought, oh, did I see the last concert of my life minus 19? It feels surreal now, and something I will remember then as well, if we don't encounter anything worse in between. Story 15 destroyed my life at the start. Got COVID that led to complications. Went from being a black belt who was super fit to having to teach myself to walk again. Can't teach martial arts anymore, and I can't fight. On a plus side, I now have a legal prescription for cannabis in the UK. I've taken up other hobbies to keep myself occupied, and I've cut out all the selfish people in my life. Story 16. It very much depends on the country, but where I was, I remember just feeling stunned. The way the government could suddenly order businesses closed, put healthy people into indefinite quarantine, fine or arrest people who visited friends or celebrated weddings or funerals. It was unimaginable until it happened. When Boris Johnson went on TV and declared Christmas canceled in the UK, I thought, this can't be real. This is like something that would happen in a children's cartoon, a villain trying to cancel Christmas. I knew people who had to wear electronic tracking bracelets and couldn't physically leave their apartment when they caught COVID. One of our friends unfortunately ended her life after being locked in her apartment for months. At another point, when 2 women were arrested for going for a walk together in a park with coffee, I thought, even the most oppressive dictatorship in history didn't do this. Before 2020, even North Korea or the USSR didn't restrict its citizens from going outside or visiting a friend. And this was supposed to a Western liberal country that respected human rights. Even once it was over, it changed me forever. The knowledge that the government could someday do this again, that our freedom was so fragile, and not freedom in the sense I had always thought about it. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to start a business. But instead, freedom so fundamental that it never occurred to me that they could be taken away. The freedom to leave my apartment, the freedom to be allowed to see my parents or my brother. I don't know of any comparable event in history when all of society, the entire nation from border to border, was turned into a prison. Story 17. In my opinion, if people would have did what they were supposed to, what we were taught to do when there was an airborne outbreak, sit thee at home, don't move, don't spread it, stay away from people. If you have to go outside and wear a freaking mask, it didn't go down that well. Misinformation played a big role in killing people, and the guy running the country at the time was an absolute moron. Story 18. I've always worked from home and found it lonely. Sitting in conference calls where someone dialed in, but I couldn't really interact. Office events I wasn't a part of, that sort of thing. So for me, it got better. My family was home all the time, which was nice. No running around bringing kids to activities or picking them up from school. And everyone started to use Teams and Slack to communicate and kept on doing it. I am one of the lucky ones who remembers it as a nice time. I mean, day-to-day personally, I was not enjoying the death, Trump's insanity, the insanity of his followers, or knowing that a lot of people were in fact having a much worse time. Story 19. It was an absolute show. It took away those parts of my job, teacher, that are enjoyable, face-to-face interaction, and increased all those aspects that are insufferable, bureaucracy. I couldn't do my #1 stress relief, attending metal concerts, and the reduced social contacts led to anxiety. Looking at the larger picture, it just goes downhill. Thousands died, even more suffered. Conspiracies flourished. Misinformation became all-pervasive and started to undermine the democratic systems in Western countries. The COVID pandemic and ensuing lockdowns were the worst period of my life. Story 20. People become sheep pretty easily. My life wasn't much affected. Grew up small town. College went online, which helped me out since I had just bought a house farther away. And the house was cheap since COVID just hit, and it was before everything skyrocketed. Never got the jab and didn't have a job where they forced us to. So thankful for how it all went. Story 21. A brief period where we took collective action to help one another, especially the most vulnerable, turned to science and medicine, and ensured everyone had the basic income support needed to survive in our country. Too soon, the government stopped taking action to care about other people, and most other people took their masks off literally and figuratively, choosing indoor dining over the public good, our health, or the lives of the most vulnerable. But for a brief fleeting moment, hope in the good and betterment of humanity and the world was restored. Story 22. It was nothing more than tyranny. Let me give you one example. Churches, Christian churches were shut down, leaders prosecuted, jailed, you name it. Not a single mosque was charged, targeted, or had any restrictions enforced against it. Not because of lack of compliance, there were plenty open and running. Politicians flouted their own lockdown rules, and police refused to do anything. Government, unlawfully as determined by the federal court, invoked Emergencies Act to shut down protesters protesting that government. Courts refused to hear legal arguments and turned a blind eye to certain legal arguments, most notably that under the QA tests can't enter the body. Years later, though the appeal court determined that was also wrong, everyone, including the court system, engaged in a system of oppression that rejected the most fundamental notion of laws, rules, and order. To line their pockets, to virtue signal, all of it was nothing more than a scam and a sham, and it will be regarded as one of the worst periods in human history. Meanwhile, the radical lefties here on Reddit supported and loved it, and lefties everywhere loved, which showed to the world the left doesn't care about freedom, only about tyranny and control. This was true in many countries, not just Canada, mind you. Story 23. As a frontline healthcare worker who worked through it, lockdowns were traumatic and extremely psychologically damaging. At work, a lot of death and fear and stress. Outside work, streets were practically empty. Grocery and household item shopping changed. Home delivery became normal. Children were socially delayed. Hell, 25 years from now, they will likely start coming out with scientific evidence of the harm of lockdowns. Story 24. It ended up being one of the most revealing moments in modern American history. It quickly became clear that a large percent of people care so little for the health of others that they'll start insane conspiracy theories to justify spitting on cancer patients afraid of dying of a preventable disease. Story 25. I was surrounded by religious cult conspiracy theorists at the time. It was incredibly scary and isolating. Luckily, I was able to get out of that situation, but imagine people screaming simultaneously that COVID is fake. But oh wait, it's actually real and a bioweapon from the Chinese. Also, masks don't work, but let's shoot ourselves up with ivermectin. Oh, and Bill Gates is trying to microchip us all with the vaccine. I'm sure these got people killed with the way they spread things. An ex-family member lost their father to COVID and would still get up to preach in his church and spread information and bully anyone who asked a question or dared to wear a mask. It was truly insane to go through, and I don't even think people will believe me in 25 years if I shared the extent of witnessing that side of COVID. Story 26. Being in Melbourne, Australia, the most locked-down city in the world, was rough yet beautiful. Couldn't be outside after 8 p.m. or travel within 5 kilometers of your primary residence. Had to have a letter on me when going to work to say I was an essential worker. Didn't see my family for an entire 18 months due to border closures. But I had some of the best times of my life hanging out with my roommate and her sausage dog, doing games nights at my partner's house with his family, and riding a bike down one of the busiest streets in Melbourne and being the only person. So mixed. Story 27. It was Orwellian. Social conditions were sharp and edgy, enough for people to almost instantaneously put up a certain sign to make sure everybody knew where they stood and weren't targeted self-righteous justice warriors. People were isolated, they got online, and where they found other people, they often found fake news mixed with similar ideas, and it kind of devolved into a nightmare. Distrust in government, medical establishment, acquiescence from the authorities to rabble-rousing troublemakers who caused long-term consequences for literally nothing. For all that energy, time, effort, money spent on everything, almost nothing changed. It only got worse. The most Orwellian part were the vaccines. It normally takes years to develop a vaccine, and it was released in Wuhan. The Chinese were doing things that are internationally outlawed. rushed into production. It was voluntary, then mandatory, and then mandatory consequences for not getting vaccinated, like losing your job and social ostracizing because you have made a conscientious decision not to blindly trust what the government and multi-billion-dollar corporations were feeding us, which is an important aspect to remember while reading the next paragraph. It's been 5 years since pandemic, and the FDA still has not approved the vaccines, only emergency use authorizations. That means if there are any horrible side effects down the river, the government and drug companies will not be legally responsible or prosecutable in any way, and people have accepted this. Interesting bit of history. When a new disease infects first known human infected, it would have been named after the city in which it was first discovered. People with dark ideology and scorching agendas made sure that WHO gave a generic sterile name to deflect away from the release in their own Chinese biological research facility paid for by U.S. government funds and authorized by Anthony Fauci, the man who led the American response to the pandemic, and go, the goal of the research gain of function. Which I understand is what made the pandemic into a pandemic. Error correction. Story 28. People were stressed. There wasn't a lot of traffic on the road for a few weeks, but ultimately, nothing significant changed because no one actually enforced lockdown stairs, which lead to the nutcases acting like it was all a political stunt getting sick faster than everyone else. It was very disheartening to follow all the rules, then watch some dips ignore them, leading to more unnecessary death, because the sack of covered hammers they voted for wanted to try weaponizing the virus against those he saw as enemies. Story 29. It showed just how much society truly hates the disabled people and wants them either banished to the fringes of society or even dead, as well as truly shattering the illusion of civility, because it showed just how easy it was to accommodate the disabled. So many jobs that couldn't be done remote suddenly could be, and they were often even more productive due to there being less distractions and less waiting and less time spent commuting. Employers found out they could literally outsource disability accommodations to their disabled employees if they just had them work remotely when they could, and they would literally do this themselves. We were told before we had to deal with speeds and data caps because we don't have the infrastructure. Overnight, ISPs and phone providers just flipped a switch and suddenly we had unlimited data. The infrastructure didn't fail. It showed just how easy it was to accommodate people with disabilities. Everyone else just didn't want to. The illusion of civility, however, was truly shattered and showed how dead the social contract truly was. A deadly disease is spreading like wildfire that may even leave long-lasting effects. COVID days might even be the leaded gasoline of the 21st century, and everyone would rather endanger everyone else because it's inconvenient to them. Shareholders, administrators, and executives gave themselves millions of dollars in bonuses. Their essential workers all got paid in thanks and got COVID-19 as a yearly bonus. People realized there was no real consequence to being a bunch of covered penises in public. Misinformation and racism was spread like wildfire, and more was done to protect them than their victims. Businesses utterly spiked the price of goods and learned people wouldn't blame those poor innocent business owners making record profits. People would argue that having to be vaccinated against a deadly disease that risked their clientele and customers alike was a horrible breach. It truly let you know you're on your own. Most people would happily step over your corpse if it was convenient for them. Their convenience before safety. Story 30. That not many people, for whatever reason, were able to see through what a scam it was and collectively lost their damn minds. I told my family my thoughts on things and they all said I was going to die. I responded with, I hope more than anything I'm wrong. And if I am, well, this is the hill I die on then. Forcing loved ones to die alone. Piling up playground skate parks with sandbags to prevent kids from playing. Forced masking, social distancing of school children for several hours a day. Teachers taping masks to kids' faces. People getting arrested for being outside. The desecration of the middle class via small business closures. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd have a hard time believing any of it even happened. Anyone speaking out and cautioning against such drastic action was ridiculed and scorned. I'm sure on Reddit, I'll get pushback for my comment if anyone even sees it, but every single person I know in real life who initially bought the official narrative no longer feel the same way and feel duped as they should. I still get angry thinking about what was done to us. It was fundamentally anti-human and society has not been the same since. ETA WTF are these comments LOL. Story 31. I inherited a house with more space than I needed at the end of 19 a couple of months after realizing I was transgender. A huge turning point in my life. Stressful as hell and awkward to go through in public. So in lockdown, I had my WOH desk job and all the time and privacy I could want to play with how I dressed and presented myself and track the changes brought on by hormones. At the same time, I had just made several friends in the trans community and ended up socializing with them regularly, and also had weekly group therapy and individual therapy, all remote of course. But that was way more people I had to talk to than I'd ever had as a depressed loner egg who was constantly confused by her feelings and unable to make personal connections. So in short, it was a rewarding, fertile period of my life. It was full of growth, discovery, deeply sharing my feelings with people for the first time, people I came to care about so much who are still important people in my life. The stars aligned for me. Everything I never knew I really needed dropped in my lap right when I needed them the most. Honestly, one of the most joyous 3 years of my adult life. I'm literally a different person now. Story 32. Hopefully, it will be the single stupidest time of my life. I had to watch my grandmother wither away and die of terminal bone cancer over the course of a year and a half through a window. All the while, her hospice facility was housing young COVID patients. But no! I was too much of a risk to my 94-year-old terminal grandmother to sit with her or even give her a single hug. I had friends with autoimmune conditions that were too afraid to leave the house because people couldn't just shut TF up and do the bare minimum to make society safer. We lost an absurd amount of good small businesses by forcefully shutting them down and imposing heavy restrictions. And we stunted our children's education, taking them out of school and pretending Zoom was good enough, siding with bloated teachers' union instead of our own kids. Everything about it was stupid. Science was bastardized and turned into a top-down dictatorship. I am the science, right off. Anyone with questions or concerns, no matter how legitimate, were called conspiracy theorists and domestic terrorists. And the people who were historically all about bodily autonomy were suddenly in favor of forced injection with experimental, emergency use authorized medicine. And then we had all the masses of morons who made it all too easy for them, fighting other citizens over TP and mask wearing, believing the craziest conspiracies about population control, nanochips, etc. These dips made anyone with real concerns look like just another asshat. We all sat back and either watched or cheered on complete government mismanagement of a crisis, along with the greatest shift of wealth in history, and didn't do about it. Story 33. I worked in education during the COVID years. One thing I noticed is how much COVID and isolation-centered policies ed over our younger generations. Those who transitioned from middle school to high school during the pandemic were wholly unequipped to handle the responsibilities expected of a young adult. Many of these kids were far behind where they should have been academically and were emotionally stunted due to lack of socialization. It was painful to see, and painfully obvious that the transition was hard for these kiddos. I understood the necessity of social distancing while we waited for a vaccine to a degree, but full-time online learning was a mistake. Many of them never recovered mentally or academically and were a terror to try and rein in once we resumed normal in-person education. Story 34. Son. Although the lockdowns were strange for everyone, they were very different for everyone too. Some people watched from behind perspex screens while their family members coughed and wheezed and died. Some scrambled frantically trying to figure out how to do their full-time jobs from home while simultaneously homeschooling their children. Some essential workers had to carry on as usual and risk their lives every day, so the rest of us could still eat and have health care if we got sick. Some had a great time relaxing and enjoying hobbies at home, while the government paid most of their salary so they could still afford food and bills. What was universal, however, is the fact that when the government hands out hundreds of billions in furlough and there is nowhere to spend it except on food, rent, and mortgages because the economy is shut down, inevitably, all those billions end up with the richest in society. COVID lockdowns made the rich unfathomably richer asterisk, and that is why we, A, had the popular revolution of 2028, where the country had a general strike which forced the government to impose a wealth tax on the richest 0.1% in order to properly fund services and redistribute wealth more equally, and that's why we live a safe and comfortable life. B, suffer under the tyranny of the oligarchy that formed not long after COVID. They destroyed our democracy, took away our rights, and reduced the value of our lives to nothing more than expendable workers to create more wealth for the oligarchs who rule us. I'm sorry you were born into this life, my son. Things didn't used to be like this. Remember that, or we will all eventually forget that things could ever be different in future. Story 35. It was a transfer of wealth and a power grab by the world governments, took away some of our rights, made clear who the sheep were, as opposed to those who critically think and think for themselves. It showed how easy it was for the government, working with social media SOs, to take away our freedom of speech under the guise of national security. It proved that our governments aren't here for the people. It proved government departments as well as many private sector megacos worked in lockstep to push the narrative and force people to do what they wanted. Years later, COVID was proven to be nothing more than a bad cold for some and a bad flu for others. And as colds and flus go, those that are immunocompromised or elderly can succumb to it. It shined a light on who the criminals are in our government, as well as criminals in the private sector. It woke many people up. It helped change the direction our country was going in. It helped change the outcome of elections. It made people say no more. We will not comply to the tyrannical BS anymore. There will still be those that are brainwashed and think the government was doing this for the safety of its people and nothing more. But the majority has spoken, and the winners are the ones who will write the history. Although history is an ever-evolving thing, new evidence is discovered, perspectives shift, and societal interpretations change, our understanding of past events constantly evolves. Story 36. I don't know if this sounds weird or not, but I honestly have no clue. I never experienced any sort of lockdown. Work continued almost exactly the same, with the only difference being a checkpoint, where you had to put on a mask and get your temperature read before you can badge in. But the masks were only ever worn for those few minutes. It was frustrating that a lot of places that used to be open 24/7 now had limited hours, and lumber prices went through the roof. I think the bigger changes I saw had more to do with the Trump presidency, and he gave people the green light to let the uglier parts of themselves shine, where previously they had kept their meanness a bit more under wraps. Story 37, how demonic people turned, and how people either blindly followed authority or people blindly rebelled, extremism essentially. The rule essentially became, you must have a piece of cloth over your face, which in turn meant nothing. The science didn't back it up, but still you saw people turning on their neighbors and family. When people say, I don't understand how the Holocaust could have happened, you saw why in COVID, if people were given a reason to turn extreme, felt justified, they will. Story 38. It was a tragic time. Not being able to spend time with my grandparents. My grandma's funeral being much smaller than it should have been for such an amazing woman. My grandfather losing his life due to COVID. I got COVID, which evolved into long COVID riddled with issues. Even with that heartbreak, others still had it much, much worse. And to top it all off, a large mass of people tried to say it was a hoax and didn't exist. With that said, some good came out of it. Working from home, reprioritizing what is important, my health, family, etc. The air became cleaner, and we adopted a dog because we were working from home. Story 39. COVID was great for my finances and house. Both myself and my SO were classed as essential, and so we not only worked throughout, but also went into work. Forced me to stop going out for dinner and drinks all the time, which was a huge savings. Saved a lot on gas because no traffic or congestion. Saved a lot on parking because plenty of free spots available. Spent some of the savings converting a spare bedroom in the basement into a rec room. Spent some of the savings fixing up the backyard and installing a gazebo. Got around to a number of projects in the house and also learned how to play darts. I know it sucked for a lot of people and created financial hardships, but honestly, I wouldn't mind going back into lockdown for a bit. I now crave a slower-paced society. Story 40. Everyone was scared, then confused, then scared again, then searching for toilet paper. Then the Nazis shifted gears to be anti-science and weaponizing ignorance. We ordered groceries online if we could, and the government stole personal protective equipment from those that needed it the most, our frontline workers. Then we got a vaccine. Then the fighting between the educated and the willfully ignorant really began. Story 41. I was in my senior year of high school when it started, quite a rural area, so it was kind of strange because I was used to not seeing people out in the middle of nowhere. But my school year was cut short and almost all plans I had for the following year months could no longer happen. Then I started college the fall of 2020, and that was an even weirder experience. Ended up moving in with my boyfriend, 5 years strong now. But some of the most formulate years of my life ended up being sort of desolate, sad, anxiety-inducing, and simply scary. I was a teenager and then suddenly a young adult. Story 42. COVID started during my second year of college, and the effects have sort of snowballed since. Last 3 years of my degree, no jobs, no internships, no volunteering, all classes online, no tutoring. I graduated with my degree in 22 and nothing to my name. Couldn't get into grad programs because none of my professors were comfortable writing me LORs, since I was never more than a face behind a screen. I still haven't been able to get a job in my field and have been bouncing around different part-time jobs trying to make ends meet. Now I live with my parents, trying to claw my way out of predestined failure. COVID as a whole showed me that I'm just another cog in a machine that would sooner crush me just to keep the damn thing greased. Story 43. I managed an auto parts store with a staff whose average age was over 50 in my town, which is right outside our state capital. We stayed and kept the world moving around us. The only people we met were either other essential workers, people who denied COVID and wouldn't lock down, or were sick and needed to travel. We all caught COVID at some point, and for my older crew who were 60, 70, it was absolute hell for them, but they truly wanted to keep working and help out deliver parts around town or answer questions for folks in the store. 2 of my staff had family members die who stayed at home, and the only people in their households who didn't was my employees. That really hit them hard. Did they bring COVID home? Probably. I have a million stories between my staff and I. It was an absolutely crazy experience. People are and were absolutely selfish and awful to us. The part that hit me the hardest was when we were the 4th wave of vaccines. Everyone else that worked in service came before us retail workers, but we interacted with the virus every day and met people who worked with the virus every day. We got in folks' nasty-ass cars and helped them understand what wasn't working. We were 4th in line for the vaccine. That really helped me understand how much the world doesn't value the person they meet every day at every store to buy everything that they need to survive. I would never do it for others ever again. Story 44, very peaceful. I acknowledge that I had immense privilege as someone who wasn't an essential worker, as someone without kids or any loved ones in danger. It was a horrible time all in all, and many people suffered greatly or even died. But still, for me personally, it was the first and last time since childhood when I was feeling good about myself and my life. I went into nature a lot, got really fit from all the walking and ditched makeup completely. It healed the last remnants of my anorexia, and I connected with a lot of old friends via Zoom or Animal Crossing. I got closer to my mom, who was the only person quarantining as intensely as I was. I got very sick the years after. Currently, I am housebound and haven't been in nature in months. So this contributes to my positive view on my time during the pandemic. It was the last time I was healthy-ish and the last time I felt like life had more to offer for me. I am now caught in my own personal little lockdown. I haven't spoken to many friends, old and new, in months. For everyone else, the pandemic is over. For me, it just went on, but with pain and loneliness, instead of hiking and meeting friends in Animal Crossing. Story 45. It was the hot political divide in the U.S. to the detriment of science. One side of the political spectrum denied science, even claiming vaccines were wildly dangerous, so as to not have to be mildly inconvenienced by wearing masks and taking safety precautions, while the other side diligently followed good medical processes to mitigate contagion. Everyone suffered because we couldn't work together, and as a society we learned very little. Disinformation flourished and millions died. Story 46. I was a 911 paramedic on duty the day lockdowns were announced in California. I remember there was a lot of fear as we had no idea what this mystery virus was that was killing people, including young, otherwise healthy people. I remember the great toilet paper and PPE shortage. We were issued one N95 in a brown paper bag and were told to basically guard it with our life, as it was the only mask we were going to get. People were breaking into ambulances to try and steal masks. We had to hide when we weren't on a call. I worked in a really bad area. I remember sitting in the ER parking lot after dropping off a patient and some car pulled up to the ER entrance. A guy hopped out, ran in, stole a box of masks off the front desk, ran out and screeched off. I remember all the dead bodies. I went into a house for a welfare check and found daughter and dad dead from COVID and mom almost dead. I remember going into nursing homes and working a cardiac arrest in one room, calling it, and then carrying our gear to the next room to start another code. I remember the National Guard setting up triage zones in the parking lots of the hospitals because of how overrun they were with patients. I remember taking sick people out of their homes knowing it would be the last time they would see their family in person, as visitors weren't allowed at the hospitals. I remember coworkers and colleagues dying or becoming disabled from long COVID. And then I remember the joy and hope when the vaccine first came out, only to be followed by right-wing media accusing healthcare workers of over-exaggerating and making it all up, and suddenly being vilified. We went from healthcare heroes to being part of a global conspiracy. Even fellow medics and healthcare workers suddenly becoming anti-vaxxers and science deniers and anti-maskers. I would say the only positive thing is I do remember for a few months, mainly March, May 2020, we had a significant drop in our low acuity callers. There was a short time where all the people that called 911 for things like chronic pain, med refills, chronic non-life-threatening conditions, people that are just hungry or cold, etc., stopped calling because they were too afraid of catching COVID. So that helped us be able to stay available for the actual life-threatening emergencies that came in. Fewer vehicle traffic on the road also made commuting easier, and there were fewer accidents. The overtime hours were unlimited. We probably had 50% turnover in the first year of COVID as many people retired or resigned if they could. The paramedic schools shut down as well, so hiring fresh bodies became a huge challenge during that time. I could probably go on and on, but the PTSD from the COVID times are real. Story 47. People were assholes, as usual in the time, maybe even today. We had leaders who openly lied about the situation, going on to blame certain ethnicities as previous leaders did for the 1918 flu pandemic. A lot of folks unnecessarily died, with a good portion just trying to live their lives. I was working in a frontline job. There was a nagging sense of fear over my mortality at points. Despite its manner of spreading being in the virus's name, they had us sanitizing every touch point regularly. I lost contact with some people that you'd call online friends over the first few months, some dismissing the fatality rate that early hospital workers were describing. They were very open about calling the folks that would risk their lives heroes, at least until it became inconvenient. When they did ease the regional lockdowns, folks would drive out of their still locked down areas to go shopping in parts that were more open. When it was eventually concluded that, yeah, masks work exceptionally well, people would still either not use them or wear them poorly. Mimics having his nose uncovered, I truly believe that a ton of that was out of some irrational spite against others. Continues to ramble on for hours. Story 48. I'm a vet tech, and I will talk about how everyone and their mother decided to get a dog or puppy since they had so much extra time at home. These people were unable to socialize their animals, though, and then they all became aggressive adult animals that were virtually untouchable. Can't do routine exams, blood work, nail trims, vaccines. Then these same people dumped, rehired, sheltered these animals when they had to go back to work, further traumatizing them and making them unadoptable. Story 49. It was awful. It showed how little your rights meant to so much of the government and how easy it would be to lose those rights forever. The moment Reddit cheered on, a priest getting arrested for holding an outdoor service where everyone sat in their cars with the windows up was sort of the moment it clicked. To then see Reddit justifying 10,000 plus people protests for George Floyd made me realize it wasn't about saving people, it was about politics. I saw so many people die alone with family and friends just minutes away, but even spouses were told no. Story 50. It was great for some and terrible for others. I lived one version of terrible in a country with strictly enforced lockdowns. The lockdowns were there to protect people's health, but it really just protected physical health at the expense of mental health. Those of us who lived alone and didn't have accessible biological family in the country were basically on house arrest for months on end. Yes, I had the option of going outside, but the weather wasn't conducive to enjoying time outside, and the only businesses you could go to were grocery stores or pharmacies. As far as I'm aware, I've still never had COVID, and I was certain of this through at least 2022 due to regular testing. But 2021 to 2023 was a period of severe depression that I would never wish on my worst enemy. Story 51. It reminded me that people will probably never wake up. They're just too stupid. We had 2 weeks where the machine stopped and everyone was fine, and we had a glimpse of stillness in the world, but we just couldn't wait to get back to our meaningless jobs and senseless, grotesque overproduction and consumption of the planet fast enough. Story 52. I gave birth in April 2020. My baby and her peers all hit their milestones early. They are all very aware of the feelings of people around them, and they freak me out. These kids are smart, as far as emotional intelligence goes. Like, scary smart and super nice. I guess I can say I was there when I saw humanity have an upgrade, and it starts with close involvement with guardians in the home. Also, being a stay-at-home mom almost drove me over the edge. I'm not the infinite fount of patience my firstborn deluded me into believing I was. Stay-at-home parents already had my respect. Now I have borderline adulation for them. I discovered that I really do need a job outside the home for my sanity. That is the legally mandated breaks. I also was able to closely understand my oldest kid's learning disorder, and he went from a D average student to a B average student. He even got 3 A's last semester. I never believed he would be able to get an A in any class. I just didn't think he would have the ability. I was wrong. I just did not understand what he needed until I could watch him learn from the outside. So, the lockdown made me a better parent and a better person. I am better able to understand my and my children's needs because of it. It also gave me hope for the future. That hope is constantly challenged, but I will be okay. Story 53. It was hell for essential retail workers. While everyone else was making fluffy posts about attending work meetings in their jammies, we were forced to endure the stress of exposing ourselves to a novel virus every day for a paycheck. We had to put up with the most demanding, self-centered, stupid customers who thought relieving their boredom was more important than our health and safety. Even most of the replies here point to how clueless most people still are to the hell we went through. Story 54. Very positively. All in all, it was a positive experience. Excluding temp grocery shortages, which really wasn't an issue except TP, the loss of concerts and music subculture event nights, lockdown was bliss. I didn't leave the house much prior to COVID. Traffic was non-existent, allowing major speeding to and from work. Dealing with entitled asshole owners over the phone was so worth it, as many animal patients behaved way better without their neurotic, anxiety-filled owners around, making the pet's behavior worse. Grocery shopping was grand. People thought I was a nurse because I was wearing scrubs and would hightail it away from me. The lockdown also gave me the final nail in the coffin for my then relationship. It was like, well, we're not supposed to see each other for 3 months. I've already told you how you were a tie and slightly abusive partner, so we're done. The loss of in-person music events brought musicians and DJs around the world to streaming platforms. I was introduced to so much new music, met and made friends with some amazing people I would have otherwise never known they existed. And most importantly, I met the love of my life this way.